All right, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone out there to this month's Making Public Histories seminar, Doing Environmental History in Urgent Times. My name is Susie Prochke and I'm from Deakin University. I'll be helping to host this evening's discussion. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded Wurundjeri country in Naarm or Melbourne, where I live and work. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, particularly on this day. I'm just going to introduce the team who we're speaking to in a moment. First, I just want to talk about briefly the Making Public Histories program. It's a seminar series offered jointly by the Monash University History Program, the History Council of Victoria, and the Old Treasury Building. Each event aims to explore issues and approaches in making public histories. The seminars are open to anyone interested in the creation and impact of history in contemporary society. And I'm very pleased that you've all joined us this evening. Before we hear from the speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment, I just want to run through how these webinars work. If you haven't done one before, you'll have noticed that you can only see us, the presenters and the hosts. We're just going to have the conversation event that you've signed up for, and then there will be a chance for Q&A. And the way that you can participate in the audience is to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can put your questions in there. And you can put your questions in as they arise. You don't have to wait until the end. If you do have technical problems, please use the chat button instead, and we'll get you some help. We have people behind the scenes who can help with that. If anybody drops out during the talk, we'll switch our cameras off, which can kind of help with things. And please be aware that we're recording this webinar tonight. We'll make that recording available on the YouTube channel that we have going after the event. And then, of course, finally, please keep your questions polite and respectful. So I'm going to unshare my screen now and introduce you to our speakers. Associate Professor Ruth Morgan from the ANU, where she is Director of the Centre for Environmental History. Professor Andrea Gaynor from University of Western Australia, joining us on Perth time. She is a Future Fellow, an ARC Future Fellow, who's currently funded to research the project Wild Cities, an Environmental History of Nature in Urban Modernity, which builds on her past work in various ways. And finally, Professor Katie Holmes from La Trobe. Katie is co-director of the Environmental Humanities Research Centre, the Centre for the Study of the Inland. And what I might just do to kick the discussion off is get you all briefly just to talk a little bit about yourselves and your backgrounds that have brought you to this point, and what brought you together on the question of doing environmental history in urgent times. I might just start with you, Katie.
Thanks, Susie, and thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. It's really lovely to be able to talk with people, and particularly share a conversation with Andrea and Ruth and yourself. So I began my research career as a feminist and cultural historian, working on women's diaries of the interwar years. And I then, from that and my interest in women's sort of private writing, moved into looking at women's writing about gardens, and then gardens more broadly. And so that garden path really led me into environmental history. And that's how I ended up in environmental history, with also interests in oral history and in gender. And if I can shortcut to the why we are all here, is, if you like, Eve Rees and Ben Huff were the special editors of edition of History Australia on doing History in Urgent Times, which was to coincide with the AHA conference of that theme. And they approached me and asked me if I would write an article for that edition, and thought about it for a while, and I thought it'd be great to do, but I also thought it'd be much more interesting if I did it with some colleagues and you know, framed it more as a conversation. So I'd worked both with Andrea and Ruth before. I thought that not only would it be great to work with them again, and knew that we could work together, but that also we came from different enough perspectives to have something, you know, interesting to say to each other in that kind of conversation, and an interesting contribution to make. So that's how it happened.
Great. Might bring you in now, Andrea, if that's okay.
Sure. Thanks very much, Susie. Thanks, Katie. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from beautiful Noongar country in southwestern Australia. Yeah, well, thanks very much, Katie, for inviting us to join this conversation. I think it was a terrific kind of, actually a high point, I think, in my environmental history career so far, especially given that the article has been so popular, so well downloaded and hopefully extensively read. I guess I come to environmental history from gardens too, in a way. I was a gardener before I was a historian. I was an environmentalist also, I think, before I was a historian. I kind of fell into history quite late, but it took me a little while during my undergraduate degree to kind of reconcile the two. But I ended up doing a PhD in environmental history, and from there have stayed in the field and watched it sort of flourish and change over time. And I've been very privileged, I think, to have had the opportunity to exercise some leadership in that space over time. Yeah, I've studied a range of different topics within environmental history. I'm actually quite undisciplined, but I started looking at land degradation in the wheat belt of Western Australia, which is a topic that I keep coming back to with colleagues and people in the land care and community-led land management space in Western Australia and beyond. And also suburban food production, which I did my PhD thesis on, and that is a topic that has stayed with me. Again, whenever there's some kind of crisis and people start growing their own food, I get asked for radio interviews and so on. So I've collaborated with organisations who are working in that space, you know, in a contemporary way as well. So both of those early areas have been really rewarding. And I've also looked at fisheries and forestry, and of course now water, which I've worked on with Ruth, agriculture, which I've worked on with Katie, and now circling back to the urban space and looking at the wild side, where I started looking at food production. So yeah, it's been a really diverse and exciting kind of time so far.
Great, thank you. And finally, Ruth.
Well, I suppose I have a little bit of a gardening streak as well. Not that I have at all any green thumbs, but I come, I suppose, to environmental history from a nebulous undergraduate past in economic history, back when that was actually much more unfashionable than it is now. And I came back to university after dabbling in journalism, thinking that that might be a path for me. And I was always interested in understanding how we got to where we are. And so I found myself knocking on the door of one young Andrea Gaynor when she was honours coordinator at UWA, and she lured me in when I was interested in, I suppose, thinking about one of the most pressing issues at that time. And that was, of course, being in the thick of the millennium drought, and that manifested in Western Australia, but also had a slightly different flavour as well, because that was where climate change was already manifesting and had been since the 1970s. So I think that was kind of a very fortuitous intersection of all kinds of interests for me. And by being interested in issues of water and the lack thereof, as well as trying to bring together perspectives on the urban experience as well as agriculture and other parts of where people live, that kind of took me into gardens as well, and then beyond. And I've since worked with Katie on questions of gender, as well as expanding into questions of how water is understood in the Murray-Darling Basin, as well as with Andrea on urban of Australian cities as well. So it was a real treat to have the opportunity to join with these two superstars to put this conversation together.
Thank you, Ruth. All right. So what is urgent about doing history in the present conditions is the question that I will start with. I think that, most people can, well, I mean, not most people, but I assume most people who signed up for this seminar will accept that, the climate change and environmental degradation are urgent issues, and there are many ways that we should be addressing them. But why history? Why does the world need historians to weigh in on this issue? And I might just start with you, Ruth, because you've had some interesting things to say in the article that this conversation is arising from, on the limits of the language of crisis as well.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. And I think I'm very much aware of the potency and power of declaring, say, climate emergencies. And that was something that I think when we were writing this piece, that was very much in the air at that time. And there were people in the university world who were questioning whether there was potentially a darker side to that kind of language of crisis, to what might be some of the drawbacks of doing that. They could, of course, understand the science behind it and the very real problems in which people were facing. But, was that really necessarily going to bring about the political kind of changes that people were after? And it was interesting to have written this piece and put these thoughts down just as COVID was really appearing on our horizon. And I think we saw how that language of crisis could be both a help and a hindrance, and that it was a public health crisis that was also a social crisis, where you had some groups, and I'm preaching to the choir in Melbourne, I'm sure, who were very much more policed than others, while others who did warrant more care were left wanting. So we can see that crises can be used and misused in interesting ways. And so I think what was interesting, contrasting the COVID experience perhaps with what we were seeing around the declaration of climate emergencies, was that with the latter, when it came to environments, it wasn't actually people who were in power making those declarations. And it was those without, those who were trying to wave for attention, to really make an impact and communicate that urgency that we're so aware of. And I think that might be something that we always need to keep in mind when we do see and even perhaps dabble in this language ourselves, is who is using that language and for what ends, and what does the language of crisis allow and for who? So I suppose, like with anything, always being attuned to the use of power and who is affected by that power and who gains from it as well.
Yeah.
If I could just chime in there. Sorry, Katie, you go.
Oh, no, I was just going to add to that one of the other things that it sort of raises is the limits of language and the limits of, a word like emergency, because what happens when you want to upscale that? It's not as if we're going to come out of this emergency anytime soon. It's going to go on for a very long time. And so you can see people searching for ever more powerful, extreme, words that try and capture the crisis and the ongoing crisis and its nature, or the crises, which are multifaceted. And I think that's one of the other things about the language of emergency, so we've got, climate breakdown, we've got climate catastrophe, we've got, the metaphors of the falling off a cliff, all that sort of stuff, in an attempt to scale up the response and to get people to take notice.
I was just going to say that in our work on water, we've been thinking about the way in which the language of crisis summons different actors, like the way in which a crisis is framed is very powerful in determining how people think about the nature of the problem and how we're going to solve it. So, yeah, I think Ruth is absolutely spot on in thinking about the way, or signalling the need to think critically about the way in which those arguments are framed, or the sense of crisis is framed, because it can summon different actors and kind of point preemptively, I think, to different solutions.
So on that point then, Andrea, what about the role of justice, which you've had a few things to say about as well, and historians getting involved in this question of power and for whom the crisis is sort of discussing for whom the crisis is most urgent, and what can historians bring to that question?
Yeah, well, I think historians bring the ability to keep watch over extended time periods. One of the features of our current sort of social environment is that we're sort of surrounded by fast moving media cycles. We're kind of bombarded by social media, and that there's a lot going on. So Rob Nixon has described it as perpetual distraction and the problem of degraded attention spans. So we're a very fast-paced society at the moment. Things move very rapidly in media cycles, and then they're kind of lost. So I think historians bring an important ability to kind of extend our attention and to keep watch over extended time periods. Rob Nixon also uses the language of slow violence to talk about environmental, or particularly environmental crises that unfold over extended periods. So, the perpetrators of environmental violence might not be so worried about the effects of their actions, because they're going to be removed in time from those effects. And very often they're also removed in space from those effects. So historians aren't the only ones who can speak to these issues, but historians, having in mind time, are in a particularly good position to ensure that people are kept accountable and that there remains a sense of accountability within our society, so that governments, corporations, whoever, the powerful who are making decisions about environmental actions that are going to affect others, realise that it's not going to be the case that it'll be forgotten in 50 years' time who was responsible for these decisions that have had momentous actions. I keep coming back to one of the earliest environmental issues that I looked at, and that's dry land salinity. And there's abundant evidence that the Western Australian government, successive Western Australian governments, knew that clearing land in the wheat belt was going to cause salinity, but they figured that that would happen down the line. It wasn't going to be their problem. They would reap the benefits of agricultural development in the meantime. And, well, if rivers became saline, if some of the other land became saline, well, that was going to be somebody else's problem. And hopefully technology would fix it. It's a metaphor for a lot of other things as well. So, I think that there is an important role for, we're not courts, but we can play an important role in keeping these stories alive and keeping alive the idea that people can't get away with, with wrongdoing or making decisions because the deleterious effects are going to be experienced by others, people in different times or places. So that's one way in which I use justice. And of course, that's related to the broader issue of climate justice, in that climate justice is intergenerational. And it also relates to colonialism, because of course, many of the, environmental sort of hazards or effects in Australia that we investigate as environmental historians arise in one way or another from, colonialism. So it's also a matter of Indigenous justice.
And we will get back to that subject soon, the contribution that historians of Australia in particular can make on this topic. But before we leave the question of why history and why historians, what about scientists? This will be they would be the group, scientists and engineers would be the group that your average person kind of thinks should be intervening in fixing this crisis, understanding it. How do historians work well or not so well with scientists? I actually might go to Ruth on this, because Ruth has been a lead author on the latest IPCC report. And so you've actually had to work with scientists quite a lot. I know you have too, Andrea, but we'll start with Ruth.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. It's really interesting how so often, whenever we think of environment, climate, any of those challenges, we are very often thinking that is a role not so much for people like us who work in the humanities and history, that instead that's a place for science. And I think there's a tendency to assume some objectivity there and some kind of technical skill set. And once enough knowledge is known about that particular problem, then that can be resolved. And it's as easy as that. But of course, we've seen with the problem of dry land salinity, like Andrea mentioned, and especially climate change, that it's not enough to have the scientific knowledge. That scientific knowledge has been rather established now for some time, but the political will, the social will for any kind of response that might mitigate climate change is obviously rather slow to eventuate. So it was really interesting to have the opportunity to work on Working Group 2, which is about vulnerability, impacts and adaptation. So trying to really see how different places around the world are responding to and preparing for climate change and how they're actually understanding the changes around them. And so I was the only historian in that working group, and we had all manner of different chapters, and I contributed to the water chapter based on my historical research. And it wasn't just physical scientists. I mean, certainly we were really fortunate to have the climate scientists and the hydrologists bringing their insights to bear. And they were, bless them, quite curious, I think, as to what I might bring to the table. They were usually quite generous and explained some of their work to me, which was very good. But we were actually very fortunate to have geographers involved, people who were very used to working with communities, working with qualitative data, experience with interviewing, and that real understanding, I think, of the structural forces that are at work here. It's not just enough to know matters of degrees and percentages and so forth, but actually how people were experiencing and making sense of the world that was going on around them. So I think some of that work towards finding that common ground had been done, even though I don't think there had been a great many historians involved in the IPCC over its 30 odd years of existence, founded in 1988. But I think what was really useful to be a part of that process was to keep bringing up those structural challenges of capitalism, colonialism, exploitation, and trying to remind, keep those issues front of mind as we were trying to work our way through, which something that is actually quite a strictly ordered system of reporting that the IPCC goes through in terms of what is mentioned, what isn't, how those reports are ordered, how you account for evidence and make all of your decision making very clear. So I think in some ways, we might emphasize too much the differences in terms of what the sciences and humanities and social sciences might bring, but there is common ground there that we could work on, and I think that was really rewarding and yet incredibly challenging.
Very many ways to do an evidence-based discipline.
Yes. Yeah.
Andrea.
Yes, scientists. I mean, I'm always struck by how many scientists now understand that science isn't enough, and they are looking for collaboration with people from across the humanities and social sciences. They, especially climate scientists and environmental scientists, realise that things are really pretty dire, and are looking for ways in which to change policy, have an effect in the wider, political and social scene. So they also come to me, or they've come to me with particular questions. So they want to know about past environments, and essentially they come to historians saying, you have oral history skills, you have archival skills, you can help us find out what this environment was like in the past. And I've done that kind of work in fisheries, and also in relation to crown decline in a particular tree in the southwest of Australia. And in both of those cases, it's been a kind of data mining exercise. So just trying to find data relating to past environments, which is all well and good, but it's not actually history. It does use historical skills though, and I can see the importance of that kind of work. So I think it's good to collaborate in that area. But in both of these collaborations, the one about the history of fishing and fisheries around the Southwest Capes and the Wandoo Crown decline, the scientists got one thing out of it, and then I went away and did actual history with the kind of resources that we jointly produced for the scientific work, and then I fed that back into the science. So, or you know, back to the scientific community as well. And I mean, they don't really know what to do with some of that stuff. The Wandoo Crown decline, for example. So the Wandoo trees were losing their leaves. We were getting stagging. The trees were clearly unhealthy, and the scientists wanted to know whether this kind of thing had happened before. So could I find any past evidence of Wandoo Crown decline? And I mean, I couldn't really, or not unequivocally. There was certainly past evidence of tree sickness or insect attack and so on. But no clear evidence for an episode of crown decline on the same scale as we were witnessing at the time. But in doing all these oral history interviews with people and looking through archival records around this particular Wandoo tree, we produced a little document about Wandoo and its relationship to the broader community. And, you know, that went into the public libraries in the areas where this tree is located. And it helps to keep a sense of the relationship between the people and this tree alive in those communities. So, you know, I think that those collaborations can be productive in all kinds of diverse and unexpected ways. Yeah, I mean, similarly with the marine fisheries one, we found that yes, some species of fish had likely declined, some had increased. There is a particular phenomenon that came out of marine scientists working on past marine environments called shifting baseline syndrome, whereby the first observations of an environment are taken as its natural state. So a scientist comes in the 1950s and observes a coral reef and thinks, oh, this is how it is naturally, not realizing that, of course, this coral reef might have been fished by you know, people for generations, and it's not actually its natural state at all. So marine environmental history is, I guess, way out ahead, I think, in a way, because of this concept of shifting baselines, which is now being applied to the terrestrial environment as well. But anyhow, so the exercise we were doing was a kind of shifting baselines exercise to try and see if we could go back past the first scientific record for this area. But we ended up getting a lot of information, or some lovely oral history interviews with people that provided important kind of insights into the subjective experience of fishing in an unregulated environment before fishing regulations came in, of diving for abalone and the relationship between abalone divers and the underwater creatures around them. So yes, I think again, doing these this kind of research with scientists, it produced scientific outcomes which were important, but it also produced sort of more discursive, I don't know, maybe conventional historical outcomes as well.
I mean, I think one of the things that struck all of us as, you know, the COVID pandemic has intersected with more discussions about climate crisis is that, of course, science has been experiencing a crisis of authority as well. You know, many people have accused scientists of being more activists than experts. And of course, that's an accusation that's levelled against historians all the time. So, I mean, I just want to ask you briefly, we've touched on it, but, you know, what is the relationship between environmental history and historians and activism?
Do you want to take
who's that one? Who's that one too?
Anyone who'd like to speak first.
Andrea, that's your area of expertise, so you can go for that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, environmental history emerged alongside environmentalism, as people probably know, but the relationship hasn't always been an unproblematic one. I'm thinking particularly in the US when Bill Cronin wrote an article about the trouble with wilderness, which really sort of deconstructed the concept of wilderness, to which many of the major environmental organisations in the US at the time were beholden. So I think it's important that environmental historians can kind of critique environmentalism, which doesn't have an untarnished record, particularly in relation to colonialism, Indigenous people, Indigenous rights. And that's sort of awkward because, of course, the problems are so big. The environmental problems we face are so big and so urgent and so important. We want to present a kind of united front. But I think it's important that historians can write honestly about some of those issues within the environment movement in order to help it, become better, in order to help it deal with some of those, the legacies. But environmental historians can also write histories that are useful for environmental activists. I conveniently have here a copy of a fantastic book I'd like to give a plug for that I've recently read. It's A History of Obstructive Environmental Direct Action by Ian McIntyre, which is a terrific survey of sort of obstructive direct action, so blockades and so on, across Australia, the US and Canada. So that kind of work can actually help the activist movement in a way. It can help them reflect on their strategies, thinking about how they develop, technical innovations in blockading and so on. And thinking about it another way, I think there's no reason why historians can't be advocates for environmental action. In fact, I think our platform, the platform that we have and our expertise gives us a responsibility to advocate in areas that are relevant. I'm a member of I'm a convener, in fact, of the Beeliar Group of Professors for Environmental Responsibility, and we collaborate on policy submissions and statements and lobbying and running events and so on, to try and push policymakers in the direction of environmental responsibility. And I guess I use my historical kind of awareness of how sorry, I'm not sure if you can hear the kookaburras, they're going off. So yeah, my historical awareness of how things change, how events happen, how politics works, in Australia in the recent past to try and facilitate my work there. Does that sacrifice credibility? Does that make me a less sort of reliable historian? Do I open myself up to accusations of bias? I guess I do. But I think my scholarship stands for itself. I think that I'm very careful to remain faithful to the past. I don't ignore evidence that, doesn't necessarily match with what I would like to see. I let the present shape my questions, but I don't let it shape the answers that I give.
Can I just add to that I think another really important contribution that historians have in the context of activism is the profound recognition of our discipline that things can be different, that there are different ways of doing things, that the world can look different, that there have been a whole lot of possibilities that have been foreclosed and paths taken that weren't, a given. And that understanding, which is not, of course, unique to environmental history, but is at the heart of our discipline, is so profoundly important in the context of activism because it, at a fundamental level says we can hope for change, we can work towards change, and change happens. Sometimes we don't know where it's going to come from. It can, emerge overnight and suddenly things can look different. And, we keep seeing that, and which is one of the very positive things about, the world at the moment, in a sense. There's good things happening, there's also terrible things happening. But I think that's a profound contribution in the historians that we have to, if you like, fueling activism, and the value of that, and advocating for change is a recognition that the world can change and will, and we can influence that.
Absolutely, and activists are very aware of that. They have a pretty well-honed sense of historical, or a pretty well-honed historical consciousness, I think. Yeah. Extinction Rebellion, for example, always talks about the civil rights movement. They talk about the suffragists, and the way in which non-violent direct action can produce change. That's their particular mode. It's not the only way of making change, as we historians know, but they're very keen on using historical precedent to give people hope and to encourage them to join a cause.
Can I just go back to the question we were talking about before, because I think it's related to this issue of activism as well, and that is the contribution that historians can make to the study of climate or environmental change or biodiversity loss, aside from what the scientists are doing, and how important I think it is to remember and recognise the deeply human predicament that climate change is, that you know, the sort of solutions that scientists might propose, or particularly the solutions that engineers, for example, might propose, that the technological solutions are never going to get us out of the predicament of climate change, because they don't address the fundamental problem of how we have got to this place in the first place. And nor do they address issues around values, you know, and ethics of care and justice and stewardship, and those things that are really central to the contribution that historians and humanities scholars more broadly can make to studying climate change and environmental change. And I think that is also a really important hook into activism around climate justice and climate change. And I think that we just too readily, and you see it all the time, cede space or cede the discourse to this idea that there are solutions everywhere, and without really thinking through what that means, or who those solutions might be affecting, what values that they're being driven by, and also that those solutions, those technological solutions that are always advocated so strongly, themselves often have really profound environmental consequences, but they're hidden. You know, they're the kind of shadow spaces, often the shadow places that Plumwood talks about. You know, the mining that is going to be the lithium mining, for example, that is all these, so many of these technological solutions are dependent upon, which is, you know, destroying communities, destroying people's lives, destroying environments in places that we don't see. So I think that's another really important contribution that as historians we have, to remind people that these things are never value neutral.
And should policymakers listen to that? What is the role of historians in addressing policymakers and policy? Maybe Ruth, have you got a view on that?
This is something I suppose we have often mulled over, and I think it's something where, you know, apart from our own, I suppose, commitment to various issues and affecting change and lending our voice to informed debate and discussion about how we might understand our current predicaments and how we might try to make some kind of positive change, is that to understand a lot of our policies more broadly, more widely, as intersecting with so many other policies. We, I think, tend to see say climate change policy in one box, and then environmental policy in another box, and they're all quite sort of separated or siloed, a dreadful term. But I think, you know, we come back to this issue of these are complex problems, they're wicked problems, to use that phrase, that are very complex and interconnected. And I think that's what historians, I mean, it's often quite a patch to say we bring the complexity into these conversations, but the world is complex, and it's showing that this is how things have come about that is really, I think, quite important, and that sometimes these policies are perhaps rather short-sighted or shallow temporally in terms of their understanding of how we've got into this situation, and that in fact we can see that sometimes these policies are not as new as they're made out to be, or they might be just in different packaging, and we can use our experience of understanding the past and different sort of episodes and say, well, this is what happened when this sort of thing was done before. Are we really, you know, did we like that outcome? Do we want to see that happen again? What kind of safeguards are there? And I think, you know, if it's narrowly seen as something as policy around climate change, could we not broaden that out and think about, well, is it about the ways that people live in some particular parts of the world affecting how people live in other parts of the world, usually the global north affecting the global south, how settler Australians try to live in this very volatile and variable climate and environment that we have in Australia, just sort of see these things as more about the way in which our society is structured, and the kinds of expectations and assumptions we have around what is the way we could be and should be living here. So I'd like to think there should be more room for historians in policy making. And I think that was a really exciting initiative that Carolyn Holbrook and David Lowe and Lyndon Garrity put together, your colleague Susie, with their collection on the role for historians in policy, that we are probably lacking a little bit of that historical insight, and that could be a real benefit to a lot of our policy making in the future.
It can be difficult though, because historians are often about the nuance and the detail and unpacking problems and pointing to the complexity, and that's not what policymakers want. That's not how they want to operate. They have a problem, they have to have a solution, they need a clear-cut answer. So, you know, historians and policymaking can be a very awkward fit. But yes, I agree absolutely that having historical context and insight is important in the development of policy. And if we think about climate policy, yes, absolutely, that relates to not only, you know, greenhouse gas emissions and carbon markets or, you know, similar, but also not so natural disasters. How are we going to cope with adaptation? The disasters are coming for us. What are we going to do about that? And I think the important work of people like Margaret Cook is keeping alive the memory of floods and the importance of not building on floodplains, a very live issue in Sydney in particular at the moment. So there's all kinds of work going on there that can inform different aspects of the climate discussion and ultimately help feed into policy. But for historians, I think there are a couple of things we could do better. I think firstly, we could learn how to speak to policymakers, learn the kinds of language and listen to their needs, not just talk about our needs and the kinds of histories that we want to write, but find out more about how they operate and what kinds of resources are actually going to be helpful and digestible to them. But also thinking more broadly, well, step down from policymakers, the general public with whom they engage. How do we reach audiences beyond the educated left-leaning middle class? How do we get our work out there to, you know, the people beyond the usual suspects? The usual suspects are really important, absolutely. You know, we need to have conversations amongst ourselves and amongst our allies. But we also need to speak to people with whom we wouldn't ordinarily have conversations, and to, you know, to do some listening as well if we're working in that space.
Can I just add a couple of things to that? I think one of the things that we can do is we can look at the impact of past policy on, you know, for example, flood management or drought management. And so there's a whole lot of environmental policy, if you like, that we haven't closely studied, or we haven't studied closely enough the impact of those policies. And drought's a really good example, you know, since the Federation drought, the federal government has been, you know, dishing out flood drought relief to farmers. And many would argue that has effectively kept unviable farms going long past the date when they should have really wound up. That's a fairly challenging thing to argue in a lot of rural communities, but there's strong evidence, I think, to suggest that that's the case. I think the other thing that's really important about policy is thinking about the ways in which policymakers seek, you know, they've got a problem and they want to find a solution, and policy is meant to be the solution to the problem. But what we also know is how you frame the problem determines how the sort of solution that you're going to come up with. And we know that the framing of the solution of the problem is critical, because what we have to think about is, you know, who wins, who loses, who pays the price. And those questions are really critical in thinking about any policy outcome and impacts. And, you know, Andrea's just referenced Margaret's work, and that's a really good example of that. And I think the more research that we can do as environmental historians to look at those impacts of past policy, where they've gone disastrously wrong, what have been the unanticipated outcomes of it. And my God, you know, Australian history is full of just disastrous environmental policies. Take soldier settlement, take closer land settlement, you know, the kind of so-called foundations of the nation. They were disastrous public policy and cost, you know, squillions and squillions of and led to devastating environmental outcomes. We've got a long history here we can look at and research there.
Margaret Cook is actually in the audience, by the way. So,
Margaret.
Shout out, Margaret.
Since you are all mentioning her. What can environmental histories of Australia particularly contribute to a global urgency here? What lessons does Australia's environmental and Indigenous history, which you've all referenced in different ways, and knowledge provide for understanding the Anthropocene? Maybe start with you, Katie.
Thanks. I think it's a really important question for us to think about. So to take that kind of global level, Australia obviously is a continent with a very deep time history of, at least 60,000, 80,000 years of human occupation and of land management. Successful, strategic, nuanced land management. So one of the things that Australian environmental history can do is bring that deep time into focus. I think another thing that it does in a powerful way is to show what happens when colonisation comes up against that deep time and the rapid devastating impacts of colonisation. So you have a kind of concertinaed history, if you like, of 230 years that show us what the kind of impacts of the Anthropocene can be. The Native American scholar Kyle Powers-White talks about the Anthropocene for Indigenous people being déjà vu, that effectively Indigenous people around the world have experienced the Anthropocene like consequences in many places. And in Australia, Australians, First Nations people are, awfully excellent examples of that, and all those implications of, the process of extraction, of colonisation, of development have led to ecological devastation. They've led to warfare, they've led to displacement, they've led to loss of culture. All those impacts we've seen, poverty, violence, have been experienced by First Nations people, and they're the sorts of outcomes of the Anthropocene that we're going to continue to see. We are seeing, and we're going to continue to see. So there's a way in which it's like a magnifying glass, if you like, of what the Anthropocene can be. So that's I would say at a kind of global level, that's one of the things that Australian environmental history can demonstrate. I think that the another way is that the kind of the potential there for environmental historians to those of us who are from settler cultures to work with First Nations scholars and communities around really developing an ethics of care and acknowledgement and of country, and what that actually means for scholarship. So I think that two-way exchange of knowledge, of place, of identity, of history, of environmental change is a really crucial contribution that we are in a position to make in Australia. And I think, Grace Carskin's book, People of the River, is just a stunning example of that kind of engaged collaborative scholarship. And I think that's another really important contribution that we can make at a global level. At a more local level, I think there's all sorts of other ways that we can contribute to understanding the impacts of environmental change, identifying the kinds of stories that we can, the story archaeologists, really, we can find stories that can move us forward, that can be empowering, that can show us the paths not taken that may be taken. We can really look for the ways in which people have built up attachments to place and what that means, and draw on those kinds of histories to find ways forward that have those ethics, if you like, of care and stewardship and justice at their core.
Any further final comments to make on that topic from Ruth or Andrea?
I mean, I can chip in a couple of further points, which only really build on what Katie's formulated, I suppose. But I think, you know, Australia has one of these really peculiar kinds of histories of and geographies. I think that's an important sort of part of what makes our history and place in the world quite unique, in that, you know, we sort of have always, well, since colonization, since 1788, struggled with our geography. And I think we've seen so often the ways in which Australia has tried to grapple politically and geopolitically with our place in the world in terms of trying to occupy some kind of middle power space. And I think that, you know, potentially, and that has been also in environmental politics as well. And so I think Australia can be both has experience as being both a leader and a laggard in all kinds of environmental issues. So there's that kind of expertise and experience that we can bring to the table, as well as the fact, though, that we are, despite being a continent and an island continent, we've also got this incredible experience of connection. And, you know, whether that's through material connections, through environmental connections, you know, long before we were talking about anthropogenic climate change, we understood that we were connected through phenomena like the El Niño Southern Oscillation. We have these very physical connections with other parts of the world, but we also have human connections. We have the amazing flows of people, the flows of resources and commodities that actually belie that sense of isolation that has kind of haunted us. So I think, you know, we have a lot of, if we open ourselves up more, we do see those connections. We see how Australia has, in this sort of part of the world, benefited a great deal from a lot of these extractive processes, but there are many people who have not benefited, and the shadow places, if we want to use that term here, they are vast, and there are a lot of shadow places to Australia's prosperity over the past however long you want to measure that. So I think we've got some really interesting tensions to explore, and that's something sort of even just looking in our own neighbourhood of the Pacific, we see the ways in which policies and our approaches to the 21st century having disastrous consequences for people in the Pacific Islands who may not, who are fighting back and saying, we're not drowning, we are fighting, but the way we live our lives is directly impacting people who are on our footstep and who we have colonized as well. So I think there's some real kind of ethical responsibilities that we need to be very mindful of when we talk about Australia and the Anthropocene and how unevenly the Anthropocene is experienced.
Andrea, any final comments?
No, I think Ruth and Katie have said it.
Okay.
Can I just make one final comment there? Sorry, oh, you're running out of time. Okay. No, I was just going to say, this is kind of more at a more theoretical level, in a sense, as environmental historians in Australia. Not only do we have that the history of the continent and our place in the world, but actually we're in a really interesting position to absorb and benefit from the ways in which environmental history is being practiced and written and engaged with across the globe. And I remember when, you know, I was very much in working in the feminist history space, that we really felt that we'd got all the kind of benefit of American theoretical scholarship and British theoretical scholarship, and that kind of shaped a sort of more distinctive Australian approach. I think with environmental history, it's much broader than that. It's not just America and the US. It's, I mean, America and the UK. It's also Europe. It's Asia. It's the Pacific, and that also makes for a very interesting theoretical mix that we are then able to bring, and the kind of questions that we can ask, and that on top of engagement with First Nations communities, I think adds for a particularly rich and provocative historical consciousness.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth, Katie and Andrea, for a fantastic discussion amongst yourselves. What I'm going to do now is disappear and hand over to Alicia Toretto, who is the Executive Officer of the History Council of Victoria. And what Alicia is going to do is to facilitate the Q&A, which will hopefully come from the audience. So those of you out there, please start putting your questions in, and I'll hand over to Alicia.
Thanks, Susie. And thanks, everyone. What a great discussion, you know, sort of, it is so urgent, but also I feel a sense of positivity when I speak with you or listen to you, I suppose, in that sense of your passion and commitment to the cause. And I thought we have a couple of questions already in the Q&A, although there's some lovely appreciation for the discussion, and that's happening over on Twitter as well. People are really appreciating that, so I'm sure there'll be loads of interest in the recording too. Now, Katie, you were talking a little bit about the local impact. You know, I'm sure our audience are doing their bit independently or in their own homes, but Anna Holmes here is asking, how do you all feel that the work of historians in relation to the environment can influence local government planning and policies? So does anyone want to have a go at local government and how we might influence there?
I wonder whether Andrea could comment on maybe not local, but state government even.
Yeah, well, state government's one thing. So yes, I've been working with a collaborator, Keith Bradby, who is the CEO of Gondwana Link, and also a historian of some sort of status himself. But yeah, we've been working trying to keep the issue of dry land salinity alive among state government circles. But in terms of local government, I think that local placemaking, local storytelling is really important. And there's so many ways in which historians, including environmental historians, can contribute to this. And that relates to, engaging with local history societies and heritage and so on. But I know that there are, historical work is being done to try and recover local environments and environmental change over time and give people an appreciation of how things used to look in their local area. And for example, water courses that have since been undergrounded, and they can work with water authorities to daylight those and make them into green corridors. So there's work being done in that space that involves historical, both technical skills in finding relevant archival sources for past landscapes, but also storytelling skills to, bring back or keep alive a sense of those benefits. But I'm also thinking about fire. I recently gave a talk to a local history societies conference in Denmark on the south coast of Western Australia. And fire is a really big issue for Denmark because it's a small town surrounded by forests. There was a big fire in Denmark in February this year. And I think that there's a lot of interest in fire. There's a very strong local lobby group that is looking for change in prescribed burning regime because they think that is damaging the local biodiversity. There are people who want to burn everything because the risk of fire is so great. So I think that history can intervene in this, and local government has an important place because they're the ones who sort of manage and liaise with the state authorities in relation to volunteer bushfire brigades, which are responsible for much of the early bushfire response in rural areas in Western Australia. So, of course, fire has been a really important issue within environmental history generally, but I think it has an important kind of local significance insofar as environmental historians can, ideally working with Indigenous people, try and recover the histories of Indigenous fire in a particular region, thinking about local fine-grained sensitive fire management, what that looked like. They can trace what happened to fire regimes after colonisation and what that might have done in terms of changing local vegetation. Also how fire response has evolved in a local region, looking at how bushfire brigades have operated, what has happened in key large bushfires, why did they get out of control, why were they so damaging, or why were they able to be controlled readily. Also keeping in mind for the local population what the experience of bushfire is actually like. In Denmark, there was a massive bushfire in 1937, which is, kept alive by some people within the community, but I think others have no idea, and they just don't understand how fast moving and how devastating a fire can be in the Denmark region. So it's important for environmental historians, ideally working with the Shire and the volunteer bushfire brigades, to keep those stories alive, to tell those stories, not to scare people, but so that they realise that they can't expect to do their fire management once the fire has been, once it's appearing yellow on the map. They need to be really aware. So, so there's that kind of thing. Also, the idea that Indigenous fire management, a return to cultural burning, is going to save us. I think that it's really important to support Indigenous people in their ambitions to increase cultural burning and to be able to undertake that practice, but that is for their own cultural benefit. It's not because it's going to save settlers who have built their houses in highly flammable landscapes. Indigenous fire management was combined with a mobile society. It was seasonal. It was for a different context. So I think historians can help to, what's the word I'm looking for, kind of dispel the idea that Indigenous cultural burning is a solution to the threat of bushfire in regional areas where bushfire is a real issue. Now, sorry, that was a bit of a digression, but it's an example of a local story that involves local government as well as state government, where environmental historians in particular can have specific input.
Yeah. Any other comments on the local? I think I was going to say down here in Melbourne, of course, with the lockdowns and people necessarily turned very much inward to their much closer communities than they had before. And I wonder if seeing their local environment up close might change the way that individual people might act, based on a broader environmental approach to their local area.
I mean, one of the things that people said about lockdown, particularly in Melbourne, was how much people got out, that suddenly, and certainly in the parks around where I live, it was, it was like Burke Street at times. You really, it was so busy, and there were people enjoying those green spaces in numbers that I just never seen before, and certainly haven't been replicated since, I might say. But I think the other thing that, and this gets back to the idea about stories, I guess, is that one of the things about working at that local level and influencing local government is finding stories from the past about, for example, saving local places, and Andrea's worked on this more recently, but if we look at in the Mallee, where Andrea and I both work, if you look at the Victorian Mallee, the campaigns to save areas that were originally seen as wasteland, so they were kind of saved from settlement, but then came to be highly valued as places of great biodiversity and sanctuary for the really special Mallee species and the incredible biodiversity that is in the area, and uncovering those stories and telling them, and helping local residents of the areas really feel justifiably proud about the campaigns that were launched and ran to save those spaces that now, of course, are havens for tourists and bring in additional income, and therefore can, if you like, keep alive rural communities that are more precarious in their economies. I think they're really important stories that local governments also cling on to because they help give a sense of pride and identity in an area.
And speaking about, those individual stories, there's a question here about oral history interviews and asking, could you share a bit more about the oral history interviews experiences and how were those interviews, or how did those interviews contribute to the research that you've undertaken?
So I might jump in there. Oral history has been, so valuable in environmental history in a whole multitude of ways. In this kinds of ways Andrea's already talked about, the sort of establishing baseline in identifying, emotional and human connection to places. It's been really important in helping, in the research that in the Mallee, for example, identifying common stories that are told by different people in different places in different times, but actually help you understand the ways in which people have lived in, made sense of and experienced their places over time, particularly if they've lived in an area for generations, if their families lived in an area for generations. It can really help us understand, I think, the relationship between the human and the non-human. And it can help us understand the way people make decisions about how they live in their place. If we're talking about a farmer, for example, Karen Twigg has done wonderful work about the ways in which farmers' attitudes to weeds are shaped by a whole sort of different kinds of values, and how those values determine then how they're going to manage the weeds and therefore the impact that will have on how they farm. And so that kind of richness really comes out from the oral history interviews that we might do. And you can replicate that in any environment that you're talking about, whether it's in a farming community or an urban setting or a coastal setting. It doesn't matter. It's the getting at that human non-human relationship and how that is understood, experienced, and the implications of that for the present management and future.
I was lucky enough to be at an Oral History Victoria event last week where Karen was talking about and exploring that, the use of oral history and gaining the trust of the community, and what that was like for her as an oral historian and environmental historian.
And in the context of climate change, it's really crucial to help thinking about how people understand climate change, how they're going to see themselves managing it, and how we can then find the sort of stories that help move us forward.
Yeah. And one thing I just might add there is, as someone who isn't a huge oral historian themselves, but in terms of a lot of the work that I've done, I've found the oral history archive itself incredibly valuable for exploring, I suppose, the environmental experiences of people that permeate their responses to the questions, and how their interactions, whether it's through labour, through their work, how they've grown up, the places that they come from, all sort of leave their traces on these interviews. And it's really interesting to read the transcripts or listen to the responses, and when they're actually not at all the focus of those interviews. So I suppose I'd just like to put in a nod to how valuable oral histories can be for all the subjects that they weren't originally intended for, and the sorts of gems you can find when you just go looking for them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And following on, I think there's a question here from Sue Jackson around storytelling, and asking if anyone would like to comment on the role of storytelling as a way to help people cope with crisis and ecological anxiety. So does anyone want to jump in? Andrea?
Oh yeah, I guess I do. Storytelling, yeah, well, I mean, storytelling is a way in which we make meaning from the world, and you know, and make the world a legible place. It's the way we understand how we should act, how we should respond in certain situations. So I think it's absolutely and incredibly important, and one of the enduring reasons for the popularity of history, why it remains, because it is essentially a narrative discipline, right? What was the other part of the question? How it makes...
how it helps people to cope with crisis and ecological anxiety.
Yeah, okay. So how it helps people cope with crisis. Obviously, there have been many crises before, and you can read many crisis narratives within history, or many historical crisis narratives, and understand that, you know, by and large, people survive, communities rebuild or move, or, you know, life goes on in a way. You know, so some lives will end, some lives will go on. So it gives you, I guess, a broader perspective on crises that may seem very real. I must admit that the climate crisis feels different in a way. Well, you know, the combined climate and biodiversity crises, because just simply because of their all-pervasiveness and magnitude. So they are different to some of the other crises that we have narrativized within history. And sometimes I struggle with that. I wonder what that means. I wonder what history can offer in the face of such all-pervasive, slow, and, you know, difficult change. I see that there's another question there relating to that point. And it's very difficult to know what to say. I mean, sometimes I do lose hope. Sometimes I, you know, find myself very anxious and depressed about the condition that we're in. I think we've got no hope. You know, we're all doomed. It's very difficult not to think like that when you think about the magnitude of the challenge we are facing. But life goes on. Life goes on. There's beauty yet. There's beauty in the present. There is love. There is community. There is the possibility for change. As Katie said earlier, one of the really important things about history is showing that things can be different. So we're in this awful predicament now, but things can be different, and we should retain the capacity to be surprised.
Thanks, Andrea. And that was a good mix in of the Harrison Croft's given us a question too, asking about how each of you manage the harm that can come in thinking about and contemplating a changing climate. So feel free, Katie and Ruth, to merge those two questions.
Well, I was just going to add to Andrea's response in the context of stories, and you know, I'm a great story advocate, if you like, and how important it is for us to find those stories that can be empowering. But I think it's also important to remember how many narratives in our history are also disempowering and disabling. And, you know, the classic one is our culture of, or our climate of, droughts and flooding rains, and that's a kind of normal, that's a normal climate, and, you know, for so long was used as a way to deny climate, deny climate change rather. And I think in the Mallee, for example, one of the kind of fundamental stories is this story of endless adaptation, and that Mallee farmers are endlessly adaptable, that they've had to be endlessly adaptable, I mean, constantly adapting to, because it's such a challenging environment in which to farm, and that their capacity to constantly adapt has been the thing that is has stood them the test of time and will see them through climate change. What I think you can see now amongst some farmers is that confidence about endless adaptability and faith in science is starting to fracture, because the challenges of climate change in some areas are you know, are not part of what has been normal in the past. So there's ways in which those stories can both give comfort, but that they can also, we can also see ways in which they're being unsettled and aren't as comforting or as enabling as they used to be. In response to the question about hope, I am a great follower of Rebecca Solnit's work, and Rebecca Solnit is a beautiful essayist and writer from the US. She's got a wonderful book called Hope in the Dark, which many of you may know. But she also is part of a group called It's Not Too Late. And she she argues constantly, we just never know where change is going to come from. And it can, as Andrea says, be constantly surprising. And I think that it's both important to recognise the magnitude of the challenge ahead, but also to know that change happens, we can influence change, and that our disciplines and the discipline of history is actually, I think, profoundly important in helping us understand that, and recognising that history and humanities have a really important contribution to make in understanding the nature of the human predicament of climate change and, you know, biodiversity and air pollution crises more broadly, and thinking through how we can retool, if you like, in order to face those challenges.
I suppose I'd just add a couple of words to what Andrea and Katie have mentioned, and I think it just reminds us of the responsibility we have as historians to ensure that the stories that we tell aren't all doom and gloom, don't suggest that the future is already preordained, and again that the openness of possibility, the opportunities that have come up before and may or may not have been explored, those paths not taken, to show that things can be different. And that's something I think as we write, and it's very easy to get into a particular narrative arc, and I grapple with this all the time when I'm writing about issues like this, to show that there might be other ways that the world might turn out, and that we can actually play a constructive role in helping bring that about.
And I was struck when you were having the conversation with Susie before that, you know, it seemed like historian as interpreter, you know, sort of communicating between whether it's scientists or engineers or policymakers. It's sort of drawing those threads together and being able to communicate them in that way. And I suppose that's the storytelling, the strength of the storytelling.
If I could just add, another aspect of that, I think, is thinking about our work as historians as taking place within the planet and being a form of human activity that we can change as well. So Ruth and I, along with Carla Pascoe-Lay and Eve Rees and Daniel May and Simon Slate as well, have been working on how sort of sustainable history and thinking about how historians can operate to make our work more sustainable, thinking about the ways we travel, thinking about the conferences, thinking about our positions within universities for those of us who are academic historians, thinking about the Australian Research Council and the kind of drivers that are built into its funding mechanisms, and how we can work to reform all of these things to make the practice of academic history a more sustainable one. So, you know, this kind of action, like one response to hopelessness is action, is activism, is getting out there and trying to make a difference. And I guess this is one of the ways in which we're doing that, to kind of reform the profession from within. It's only a small way, but, you know, all of these small ways, I guess, add up to something. Well, we hope.
And I think that links really well to a question here from Sophie Greenway, who asks whether you have any views on the length of time academic publishing takes, given the urgency of the situation we are in and the topics that you're writing about. Are you finding any ways to get around that?
Well, I must say recently the paper that we wrote on sustainable history was turned around by the journal Environment and History in a very short time, because they saw that work as particularly urgent. But that said, I'm sure, you know, a lot of historical work is urgent in one way or another. And if we weren't living in such desperately neoliberalised conditions, then we would have more time and capacity to do these things. It's getting harder and harder. I'm an associate editor for a journal. It's getting harder and harder to find reviewers because people are just so overworked. It's hard for us to find the time to then turn things around within the journal itself. So I think it's part of a broader symptom of the higher education sector under increasing stress. Because of our values, essentially. It's being run as a business rather than a broader social enterprise that's interested in improving knowledge, improving access to knowledge for everybody.
So keeping the critique of that system, I think, is really important, and recognising that. I would also say I think it's really important that we try and find and make time and allow time for, particularly for junior scholars, to do the kind of slow work of thinking that the crisis needs. I mean, it's a really interesting, tension there, the whole kind of pressure of the moment where this need to respond quickly, urgently, but actually also what we need to do is some deep thinking and recognise that takes time, and it can't be fit into universities' neoliberal agendas that want us publishing, umpteen articles per year.
I just, echo those comments and follow up with another part of Sophie's question there about ways around this debacle we have with the length of time that's involved with peer review and publishing. And of course, we treasure the peer review process because that's what really helps, I think, for the most part, improve our work, and it helps us engage with more readers and to really refine that process. So it's really important to do. But I think there's different ways, different formats of getting your message out there, getting your work out there, whether it's something that you do in terms of a personal blog, or whether you make pitches to whether it's your university's media hub, whether it's the Conversation and other online fora, whether it's letters to the editor, they can be incredibly effective as well. So I think trying to be a little bit creative, going beyond the article, and whether it's a talk, all those sorts of things, a podcast, there's different ways of going about it. But I know how tricky it is to take that leap and to try to dabble with other audiences and other genres of publishing. But I think it is one way to, I suppose, chart out your territory, your intellectual contribution. So I would encourage you to explore that.
I've been listening to a fabulous podcast recently called Drafting the Past, which, if people don't know, is well worth listening to. And it's a series of interviews with historians. They're all in the US. And it's quite striking how many of them have blogs and how they use the blog as a way of testing out ideas, gaining a sense of audience, being challenged, responding, and then use that as a springboard, if you like, to developing a book or an article.
And perhaps the ways that you're suggesting, the sort of alternate pathways to sharing that information, is a way to reflects the tension Sophie was talking about of being an ECR, but, and wanting to protect the work that they're doing, but also act and take action and spread the word. Well, I think we might have time for one more question, and there's one here from Kathleen Neal, who does say it's a complex one, so let's tease it out. So it says, the question is, what is the history of the interaction between the rhetoric of crisis and the rhetoric of personal versus institutional responsibilities? For example, has crisis been linked to more things like calls for individuals to abandon single-use straws, or to demands for legislative change towards fossil fuels? And what is it that drives that relationship?
Kathleen.
I think one of the interesting things, I haven't really thought about this much, but just off the top of my head, one of the interesting things is who's calling the crisis, and it goes back to where we began the discussion in many ways, and what's the intent behind that. And it's not the fossil fuel companies or the governments that are calling, the environmental crisis. It's the activist groups. And the activist groups others, and the scientists, and you know, all that side of the conversation, if you like, or the discourse, they are identifying the investments and the neoliberal agenda and the fossil fuel companies, and calling out those who are the ones who are the great polluters and who are, you know, really destroying the planet, continue to emit, etc. And they're not necessarily the ones who are saying all the individual action is going to be what saves us. I would suggest it's more the, you know, the other side of that conversation are the ones who are saying, well, you know, you have to use, stop using single-use plastics, you have to, you know, use the sustainable straws, etc. And that recycling is going to be the answer to, you know, the plastic patch, for example, when we know that that's not the case. And so I think that that relationship is an interesting one, and the emphasis on individual action is not necessarily coming from the activists. They're recognizing that's important, but they're not saying that's the answer. They're saying that governments and fossil fuel companies, the heavy polluters, need to change and need to stop emitting in massive quantities, with the exception perhaps of food and the impact of what we eat, because we do know that those individual choices, you know, made collectively en masse, will have a significant impact, for example, in methane emissions and reducing land clearing and etc.
Along with questions of food waste and
yeah.
all sorts of things. Yeah.
I think an interesting issue there is the way in which resilience is framed. And I think that Katie's work on the Mallee gave some insight into this, the way in which resilience or its analogues tended to be regarded as an individual characteristic or quality, something inherent in an individual. So I think it's important to be quite discerning when thinking about the way in which resilience is framed within the context of climate change adaptation discourse, and whether that is as an individual characteristic. And so if you're resilient, that's well and good for you. And if you're not, well, you know, survival of the fittest and all. Or whether it's framed as a community characteristic that can be developed and supported in particular ways, which I think is definitely how it should be viewed. But, you know, that kind of discernment, or the way in which we can pick up on the implications of framing these kinds of terminology within climate discourse, that has come from historical analysis, that kind of flag. So I guess that's just another contribution to the debate about individual versus collective responsibility. There's also the sort of flip side of individual versus collective characteristics, and where responsibility, or where responses and successful responses come from.
Ruth, any final words on this one?
Gosh, I wish I had some zinger to end this curly question on, but I think one of the things, though, just, you know, when we do talk about plastics, and I suppose those materials that we take for granted in our very modern, fast-paced lives, is perhaps the silver lining of those rather, I suppose, nebulous campaigns about plastic straws, which I think are a bit of a distraction from bigger problems. You do realise just how reliant we are on the products of petroleum, and how baked in our fossil fuels are into our everyday lives, and the sort of scale of the social shift, the political, the total shift we are overdue to have to find alternatives to these things that make our lives so easy. Our lives being those of us who are very privileged to live in, usually I would say, cities in Australia, but not for everyone, of course.
Well, thank you all, and thanks to everybody for your questions. We nearly got through them all, but I'm going to invite Susie back on and she will wrap up the event for us.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you again, Ruth, Katie and Andrea, for a fantastic discussion. I'm just going to share the screen again for a second so that we can thank one of the, well, we can thank Monash University Publishing, who are one of our sponsors. And they are very kindly giving you all a book because you haven't got enough reading to do. This is reading for fun, not work, I hope. So thank you, Monash University Publishing, and come back again to see our next Making Public Histories seminar, which is going to be on refugee lives, memories and communities. And we're going to be featuring Ruth Bayland, Chivu and Shamaran Slewa Yunan on that final seminar for the year on the 24th of November. So check the History Council of Victoria website to register for that if you're interested. Thank you again to our audience members for coming along and sticking with our event, which we also stuck to. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Good
Thanks
night.
very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Susie.
you.
Thanks, Alicia.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks all.